also flushed out a number of other academics who disagreed strongly with Dr. Gerber's assertion. One of them's David Flint, a senior lecturer in law at the New South Wales Institute of Technology. Mr. Flint and Dr. Gerber are talking to Paul Murphy.
Dr. Gerber, on this program a fortnight ago, you said that the British didn't have a good root of title to the Falkland Islands when they took them over in 1832. Do you still say that?
Well, I was stating a historic fact. History doesn't change. Yes, I do maintain that.
And could you elaborate on that?
Well, certainly. The British abandoned the Falklands in 1774, leaving a lead marker and a flag. Well, that's fine, but then the Spanish came in, settled the islands, and indeed it remained a Spanish possession till the Spanish Empire crumbled, and when the Argentinians then took over as the inheritors of Spain's title, and they actually went further in 1820. They actually proclaimed the islands, appointed a governor, Daniel Jewett, who actually landed there and hoisted the Argentinian flag. In 1823, another governor was appointed, and then finally in 1829, a man called Vernet was appointed as governor. He owned virtually the whole of the East Falkland Islands, raised sheep there quite happily, till the Americans came along in 1831 and razed the settlement to the ground, taking everybody off the island to be tried for piracy. Sort of the ugly American raising his head in 1831. Now this left a tiny little gap during which the island was actually unoccupied, and before the Argentines could once again reclaim their possession, the British just marched in. Well, now my view is, and I remain totally unrepentant, that a mere hiatus in administration and settlement does not affect the persistence of sovereignty. The Argentinians had sovereignty in 1831, and the British had no right to march in. Well, that's why I said they had no root of title.
David Flint, would you like to react to that? Because I think you hold a contrary point of view.
That's correct. I would have some reservations concerning the historical story that we've just heard, particularly in relation to the Spanish approach. The Spanish eventually did recognize the British title to the Western Falklands, but in any event, I think that's irrelevant, because by 1833 you had two competing claims, that of the United Kingdom and that of Argentina. However, in 1833, the British came in, and since 1833, for 1.5 centuries, you've had peaceful, continuous, and effective occupation of the Falklands.
Oh, that's a very emotive statement. It can't have been all that peaceful since Argentina's claimed that Britain's position is wrongful and retained its claim ever since. So it's not all that peaceful.
Yes, but this is a principle of international law in relation to the acquisition of territory.
Oh, I don't know that I even come at that one. I mean, what you're saying is that the doctrine of jus possessionis. That's simply a neat Latin phrase for saying possession is 9/10 of the law. That's not a very civilized doctrine.
I think what you're really saying, Professor, is that in relation to the occupation by the British in 1833, that they were using force and using it illegally. Now, I would say that you have to test the validity of that act that the British undertook in 1833, not by today's law, but by the law of the 19th century.
In other words, force was okay then?
Oh, yes, because in the 19th century there was no United Nations, no League of Nations, no International Court of Justice. A state, to enforce its claims, if it couldn't get them by negotiation, had to resort to force. There was nothing else but self-help, as in any primitive society. Today, of course, it's quite different.
Well, how do you feel about that? In this century, we're so very civilized, no force is ever used at all. I mean, you look at Afghanistan and Poland and Czechoslovakia, it's all so peaceful and united nationally. I must confess, if this century surely is the century in which force has been used for more than in any other.
Of course, the Argentinians have used it in their latest claim, haven't they?
Yeah, well, look, I don't hold any torch for the Argentinians. I don't think that they should have marched in, but then by the same token, I think Britain is in an equally weak position because it shouldn't have marched in 1832. So really, to put 150 years between us and say, well, we've now had the civilizing influence of the United Nations is an argument I find singularly unappealing.
I think that the strength of the British claim is well testified by the fact that in the 50s, when the British took the question of the dependencies of the Falkland Islands to the International Court because they were a little tired of continuous Argentinian incursions there, the Argentinians refused to appear before the court. And I think you can draw an obvious conclusion from that. and that is that the Argentinians know that quite clearly, under international law, Great Britain has a firm, clear title to the Falkland Islands. She's been there almost as long as the Australians and before then the British have been on this continent. If you permitted this act of the Argentinians, this illegal act of the Argentinians, in attempting to retake the Falkland Islands to continue and to be strengthened, then you'd permit all sorts of territorial disputes to be reopened all over the world.
A final word from you, Dr. Gerber.
Well, I agree with Mr. Flint on the latter proposition that the 1955 application, which he refers to, was an application made by the United Kingdom to the International Court, but this included both the Argentine and Chile. Neither of whom, of course, were party to the optional clause, and both refused to accept some territorial jurisdiction. I don't think there's too much to be into this. Britain had that way the upper hand, but I still maintain, as I did a fortnight ago, that as between competing claims, that of the Argentinians is substantially superior of Britain.
Gentlemen, thank you very much. We'll leave it there.
Well, the Paul Gerber speaking to Mr. David Flint and Dr. Paul Gerber.
Invited to the studio two men who studied the subject. Paul was talking with Miguel Bretos of the University of New South Wales and David Flint of New South Wales Institute of Technology.
The first question for both of you, Mr. Flint, what is your view of initially the Argentinian invasion of the Falklands? Well, my view is that it's illegal. The Falkland Islands are British sovereign territory. Argentina does have a claim, but the only way in which she can settle that claim under international law is by peaceful means, negotiation, judicial settlement, or what have you. But the United Nations Charter says that Argentina must not do what she has done. Or what's your view then of the British invasion? Well, again, under the Charter gives the United Kingdom the right to defend herself in these circumstances. What she is doing now is exercising that right of self-defense in liberating what is in fact British territory. Mr. Bretos, then, what is your attitude towards the Argentinian taking of the Falklands?
But I think if we accept the fact that Argentina is sovereign over the Falklands, she has merely exercised the inalienable right of sovereign states to police and, in effect, govern the territory.
And so you see a British invasion as what?
I see the British invasion as an act of force, essentially, to turn back Argentine legitimate rights over the Argentine.
In 1961, there were two United Nations resolutions calling for decolonization of the Falklands initially, and then a second resolution, decolonization of the Falklands immediately. Britain refused to abide by those UN resolutions. If it refused then to abide by UN resolutions, how can it then claim the right to invade on the basis of today's UN resolution? You have to make a distinction, a very clear distinction between Security Council resolutions, which are binding, and resolutions of the General Assembly, which merely have a recommendatory effect. General Assembly resolutions are, generally speaking, of no legal effect. Security Council, however, has absolute power, and its resolution is one which determines issues. Now, getting back to those
Two resolutions, they resolve that Britain decolonize. Britain has been the greatest decolonizer, voluntary decolonizer in the world. Decolonization involves the concept of self-determination. Self-determination for whom, you might ask? Well, it's self-determination for the people on the territory. The people on the territory have determined that they don't want to become part of Argentina. So the British have granted the option of decolonization to the people of the Falklands.
And they've clung to Britain.
And they've clung to Britain, and they're entitled to... incidentally, might I add that the vast majority of the families on the Falkland Islands have been on the Falkland Islands longer than the vast majority of families have been in Argentina. Argentina is essentially made up of immigrants who arrived after the British took over the Falkland Islands.
If I'm not mistaken, the basis of the British claim to the Falklands is that they have held the islands peacefully for the last 150 years. Is that correct?
Essentially, that's it. And when they did move in 1833, they were merely consolidating a title that they already had. In fact, they did discover it, and they'd had an early occupation there.
And the basis for the
I'd like to
Argentinian...
correct a couple of points.
You're already, okay.
Yes. Because, number one, the question of discovery, I should like to say this is a plug for the Spanish Empire in the 16th century. It's not at all clear. The Spaniards may have discovered it in the 16th century. And one must say that when the British took over the islands in 1833, they dislodged an existing and rather sizable Argentine settlement there.
So you're saying they've held it peacefully for perhaps even longer than 50 years before the British occupation?
They held it peacefully since the 1760s.
We will continue after the break that debate on who owns the Falkland Islands. So Australia Now, we continue the debate on who owns the Falkland Islands. The question is, who will win?
Well, I suspect that in the initial phase, that is the liberation of the islands, Great Britain will triumph.
And who do you think will?
I think in the next few days, I agree with David. We're likely to see a British victory, and I'm sure that in the next few hours we'll be beginning to see the beginning of the end, as it were. But again, what are they going to do afterwards?
So you're saying what is happening now is just the first act in a very long play to be continued. What do you see as the next act?
I suspect that the British will, even though they have withdrawn them, they will probably go back to an extent on the very magnanimous concessions that they made in the negotiations. The concessions have, of course, been published, and I think that may well be a basis for some form of sensible negotiation with the Argentinian government for a compromise which could satisfy the wounded pride of the Argentinians and yet the wishes of the Falklanders.
Will that very sensitive wounded pride you discussed earlier of the Argentinians be allayed by that? Do you think they can suffer that?
Well, again, we're dealing with the future. Historians make very, very bad prophets. I just don't know. But if one is to interpret the recent noises from Great Britain and the position that Mrs. Thatcher has taken on the entire issue, I just don't see where this magnanimity is going to come, at least in the foreseeable future.
So conflict, till, as you say,
I think we're very much in the midst of a very conflictive situation.
Thank you very much for coming in.
Thank you.
The situation, that was an interview recorded on Friday, and thanks to both those gentlemen for coming in. One interesting comment made by Miguel Bretos, the Spanish-speaking lecturer from the University of New South Wales, is that Argentinian pride has got to be understood, and that Latin American feeling. And the loss of pride and the loss of standing and self-esteem that will eventuate because they lose the Falklands may, as he said, a backfiring effect. So that the Southern American situation could be, and he's not suggesting that it will, but it could be unstable because of the need for Argentina to, justify itself by perhaps attacking another country in its group. Who knows? See what happens. But it's an interesting situation and very well explained by those gentlemen. In a bid to...
The council has ruled that Hrvatski Tjednik